Before machines took over, planks were made by hand. In today's AgedSkills history episode, craftsmen saw planks the traditional way, working a long saw through solid timber by hand and by rhythm alone. Let's start by preparing the log. To secure the log on the round timbers, saddles are hewn at the proper locations. Once the log is positioned on the saddle, it's fastened with log dogs. Using a straight edge, the working depth is first established. Based on the measured dimension, the edge is marked on the first side. At the ends, green wood can be removed relatively easily. To ease the work in the middle section, vertical scoring cuts are first chopped in. This breaks up the wood fibers at regular intervals. With the remaining ridges scored, they can be knocked away with the axe relatively easily. Once the log is positioned on the next lower saddle, the fine dressing of both side surfaces has already begun. True carpentry skill is demonstrated in handling the broadaxe. With the razor-sharp 9-inch blade, the rough-hewn surface is dressed smooth and true. The short handle of the broadaxe is offset to one side, allowing the blade to run parallel to the surface without the hand striking the log. The marking compound for the chalk line was traditionally made from soot and linseed oil. By snapping the blackened line stretched taut from end to end, perfectly straight lines can be laid out. Once the endpoints are transferred down to the lower edge, using a plumb bob, and connected across the end grain, the log is rolled over to mark the underside. Using a rocking motion, the heavy log can be worked up the inclined ramp piece by piece. The log is properly positioned when it projects about halfway over the saw pit. Until the saw finds its line in the cut, it must be worked very carefully. The first cut is made down the center of the log to relieve the internal tension as the wood splits evenly on both sides. When the cut reaches the far end of the log, the next cut is started. For the first few strokes, the top sawyer steadies the blade with the toe of his forward boot. Since the saw only cuts on the downstroke, it simply needs to be repositioned on the upstroke. timber framing, oak was exclusively used in traditional construction. Sawing through a 30-inch thick oak log typically took 3 to 4 weeks. Cutting the 20 to 30 cubic meters of timber needed to frame a 2-story half-timbered house required a solid 3 months. Through painstaking work, the log has now been cut with 7 saw kerfs, each initially cut only halfway through. When the final cut reaches the head end of the log must be rotated to bring the other end forward. Once the log is secured in its new position, it's ready for the second pass. First, the saw teeth must be resharpened. Because the saw only cuts on the downstroke, it's lifted slightly away from the wood on the upstroke. This creates an elliptical motion that conserves energy. To prevent the log from splitting apart prematurely, the saw cuts aren't taken all the way through initially. A few inches of holding wood are left in the middle to keep everything together. Only after the log is bound with chain at the open end and drawn tight can the final cuts be made through the center. Since the center line can be held more accurately from above than below, the cuts meet cleanly at the top. On the underside where the trestle interferes, a small angled surface remains uncut in each board. When separated, the holding wood between some boards still grips firmly. By these telltale narrow grey surfaces, an expert examining old timber frame buildings can identify whether the timbers were pit sawn by hand.